Welcome to another episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, and today I want to start with a question for you. What will life be like in 10 years' time? Strategic property investors think in 10-year timeframes. They don't worry about what's going to happen to interest rates or the economy in the next 6 weeks or even in the next 6 months. In fact, in my mind, 10 years is short term, and the successful investors I know ponder about what the housing markets will be like in 20 years' time or 30 years' time, what aspects will be the same, and what will disappear. I mean, if you think about it, the property investments you're buying now are to help secure your future in 20 or 30 years' time. And we're living in times of rapid change at the moment, aren't we? But most of us don't like change. In fact, it makes us feel uncomfortable. We like a level of certainty about the future, about our health, about our jobs, as well about the world of finance and property. But there are lessons in history that can provide us with valuable insights. So in today's show, I'd like to talk about some of the things that never change in a world that never stops changing. Successful investors and business people need to be prepared for change, but also understand the things that don't change. Now, regular listeners know I usually have a guest on the show, but every now and then I like to have a chat, just you and me, and this is one of those shows. Hopefully by the end of today's show, you're going to come up with some ideas about how to get some more certainty, some clarity in these uncertain times. So, thanks for joining me.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment, and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect, and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now, here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Today I'd like to discuss a few things that never change in a world that stops changing, as I explained in my introduction. And that's because the things that never change are the most important things to pay attention to. However, change gets most of the attention because it's exciting, it's surprising, it's something the media can commentate on, isn't it? I've found that to be a successful investor and a successful business person, I've had to be prepared for change, but I've also had to understand those things that stay the same. Now, don't be confused by all this. It's not a play on words. Stay with me and you'll get what I'm getting at, I hope. And that'll also help you understand how all this relates to property investing, your money and your success. You see, predicting the future is hard. Very few can do it. I mean, just look at all those wrong predictions over the last couple of years. On the other hand, understanding what stays the same, well, that's actually very useful, particularly in challenging times like we're currently experiencing. Of course, I still have no idea what's going to happen in the future, but I'm a little bit less surprised, whatever does happen, if I have a handful of assumptions that I put my faith in to guide me moving forward. So let's look at some of the things that never change in a world that never stops changing. First of all, I believe more people wake up in the morning wanting to solve problems than wake up looking to cause harm. Now, I read this statement in a blog by social media commentator Morgan Housel, and I'm sure he's correct. I, in fact, love listening to his podcast as well. And I'm an optimist and I have faith in society, but I recognise that those who come out with all the negative messages are getting more airplay in the media than those who come up with positive messages. But it's always been that way. And that's what's inciting fear, worry and negative sentiment in a lot of Australians. The media loves the negative headlines because it gets eyeballs on their websites, and that's what their advertisers pay for, isn't it? Fact is, in life you get what you expect. The only question is, what do you want? Over the years, I found that those with an optimistic outlook do much better in life, in business and in their investments, while those with a pessimistic outlook tend to be worried and find what they're looking for: bad times. Now, in her book, The Optimism Bias, Tali Sharot wrote something along the following lines. She said, "Optimism protects us from accurately perceiving the pain and difficulties the future undoubtedly holds, and it may defend us from viewing our options in life as somewhat limited." She went on to say, as a result, stress and anxiety are reduced, physical and mental health are improved, and the motivation to act and be productive is enhanced. She went on to say, in order to progress, we need to be able to imagine alternative realities, not just any old reality, but better ones, and we need to believe them to be possible. Now, I agree with what she said. Think about this. If we're not optimistic, none of us would ever bother setting up businesses, employing people, or taking on the risk of getting involved in property investment, taking long-term loans and a financial risk. If we're totally realistic about how often people fail, how often things go wrong, or how many property investors never build a substantial property portfolio, we'd never even bother getting started, would we? I've said it before. Your thoughts lead to your feelings lead to your actions, and your actions lead to your results. In other words, your outside world is a reflection of what's happening inside your mind. So, my suggestion to you is feed it with positive, optimistic thoughts. The next thing that doesn't change is another interesting expression I learned from Morgan Housel, and he said the world breaks about once a decade. It's true. There seems to be actually very few exceptions to this. Looking back over the 50 years or so I've been a student of economics, there's a major disruption every decade or so. It could be economic, political, military, social, or COVID a couple of years ago. I mean, 4 years ago, there was the COVID pandemic, widespread around the world, the looming recession and political and social unrest. Now, looking back, sometimes it's easy to see these disruptions in hindsight. Sometimes they don't seem as scary, but at the time when they come, no one saw them coming. At the time, it was easy to feel scared by the uncertainty, but having lived through 7 decades of uncertainty now, I've learned that things only get better, and most of the things you worry about never occur. But worrying spoils your days today thinking about what may or may not happen in the future. Now, apart from all these significant disruptions that happen once a decade or so, I've mentioned on previous podcasts how I believe in the unexpected X factor or black swan event that comes out of the blue every year or so to mess up the best laid forecasts. Sometimes they're on the positive side, sometimes they're on the negative side. Again, that's one of the reasons it's very hard to make accurate forecasts. The third thing that doesn't change in this world where everything does seem to keep changing is that bad news is never as bad as it sounds. How many times does the end of the world as we know it need to arrive before we realise it's not the end of the world as we know it? Of course, those with a long-term perspective who've lived through a number of economic shocks, who've lived through a number of property cycles, tend not to get shocked when major events like those we're experienced over the last couple of years, or even now with inflation that we're experiencing now. We don't get shocked when these things hit us. As I've said a few times, I see patterns in the chaos that other people see, having been around the block a few times. However, those who've not experienced these type of shocks tend to worry more and imagine the worst because they've got no perspective to rely on. And that's one of the concerns I've got at the moment with a new breed of property gurus out there telling you what to do with property. They haven't experienced the ups and downs of this cycle. I'm hearing stories about an 18-and-a-half-year property cycle. I've been investing for over 5 decades. There's not an 18-and-a-half-year property cycle. The property market definitely does cycle, but there's others who are talking about what's happened over the last couple of years because they've done really well, but they don't have the perspective to take into account all the information. That comes with time. It's a learning fee that you've got to pay to the market or to a smart advisor. The fourth thing that doesn't change is this too shall pass. Nothing too good or too bad stays that way forever. I've found the type of major upheavals that occur aren't as scary if you've got an underlying belief that they're going to just keep happening, but it's not going to prevent the long-term growth of our economy and our property markets. So yes, we're going to have some challenges into our economy, social challenges, worldwide geopolitical problems. Inflation will go up and it'll go down, and interest rates will go up and go down. But in the long term, our property markets are going to be driven by a strong economy in Australia. The fundamentals are very strong over the long term, a rising population, more household formation, and a wealthy population. So each boom sets itself up for the next downturn, just as each downturn plants the seed for the next upturn. In Australia, our property markets have had a long-term upward trend, but in the short term, sure, they move up and down. You've got to be prepared for that. The fifth thing that doesn't change is that history doesn't really repeat itself. Look, we've all heard it before, history repeats itself. Look, it's an inane statement that seems so wise on the surface, but it crumbles under serious scrutiny. Now, I've mentioned Morgan Housel a couple of times, and in fact I got the concept for this chat with you today from one of his blogs from a while ago, and he wisely said, history is mostly the study of unprecedented events which, ironically, we then use as a map for what could happen in the future. The problem is that the world now economies evolve over time, and what worked in the past may not work today or tomorrow. History is the past. History is merely what occurred yesterday and before. Interestingly, I know a lot of the younger property experts, so to speak, and you're not seeing the air quotes there, are saying, look, we've got all the data, we've got all the history. I don't, and the team at Metropole do a lot of research about the history, but we spend a lot more time looking at what's going to happen in the future, because if you keep looking in the rear vision mirror, you tend to have accidents. So history is the past. As I said, it's merely what occurred yesterday and before that. Take, for example, the theory the Reserve Bank and other central banks used for a number of years before we experienced the inflation that we currently have experienced after COVID. Remember, they kept lowering interest rates in an attempt to stimulate the economy and lower unemployment. But in reality, it didn't work that time around, did it? Then, during the COVID crisis, the Reserve Bank and central banks around the world kept our financial system from falling apart because of what they'd learned in the past, in the process ruining a lot of assumptions people had about how the economy works and how bad the recession would be. We didn't have a recession then, did we? Now, for the last few years, central banks around the world have been trying to decrease inflation by raising interest rates. And that doesn't seem to have worked anywhere near as well as they'd have liked to, has it? Just like stimulating the economy with low interest rates before COVID didn't really work either. Interestingly, it was only the huge amounts of money that was poured into the system to support us during COVID that got inflation to creep up, didn't it? Well, it did more than creep, didn't it? So here we are now, and sometimes it's hard to make sense of the world. I mean, if you think about where we are now, the world would have been unfathomable a decade ago. So many things are changing, but some things won't change in the big picture of the world and also in our housing markets. So I think a couple of the things that aren't going to change in our housing markets are that our Australian population is going to keep growing. I know they're going to slow down immigration a bit because it got a bit too much ahead of itself, but both sides of the government, Parliament, I guess, so whoever's in government, has a business plan to grow Australia's population to 40 million people from about 27 million now by the middle of this century. In other words, we're going to add another Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane to Australia's population with all the challenges that go with that. So that's going to stay the same. Our population is going to keep growing, not as much as it did last year, but it's going to keep growing because we need more tax-paying residents to make up for the baby boomers that are retiring. So another thing that's going to stay the same is we are going to need to build around 240,000 dwellings each year. The challenge, of course, is we're not going to be able to get that number out that the government's been wanting to, but we talked about that on previous podcasts, haven't we? Another thing that's going to stay the same is congestion on our roads. In fact, it's going to get worse because there's going to be so many more of us and the infrastructure is already creaking under the challenges. More things that are going to stay the same are that Australians are going to continue to aspire to home ownership. It's going to be more challenging, no doubt about that. But a lot of the immigrants coming to Australia, most of them actually aspire to buy a home. That's the reason they're coming here, isn't it? So our housing markets are going to be underpinned by the strong population growth and the fact that people want to own homes. Another thing that is going to stay the same, that won't change, is that the property cycle will continue. We'll have ups and downs. What has changed over the years with the property cycle as I've been investing is the cycles are getting shorter. And that's not surprising with the way that the economies and the financial system works nowadays with the 24/7 news cycle and the online economies. But each boom leads to a bust, as I said earlier on today, and each downturn leads to the next upturn. But what will stay the same is over the long term, property prices will keep increasing. A portion of that's, of course, going to be inflation, but it's also going to be the fact that how we live, where we want to live, and we're living in the best country in the world, in cities that are on the water, not in the middle of nowhere in general. That's how we want to live, and that comes at a cost. Another thing that won't change is Australians are going to continue to invest in property. This is very different to other countries, but just a lot of Australians, over 2 million of them, have become small business people providing residential accommodation. And I think another thing that's not going to change is that we're going to keep living in the best country in the world at the best time in history. But some things will be different over the next decade. I think we're going to stay with a period of higher interest rates for longer. They're going to drop eventually, but not to the levels we had during COVID and even before COVID, where they were low to be on the stimulatory side. I also think one of the things that's going to be different is we're going to have periods of very strong rental growth over the next 4 or 5 years at least, until the housing shortage is starting to come under control. Rents are going to keep rising strongly because of the significant undersupply. I believe another thing that will change slightly is, despite the desire to own a home, there will be lower levels of home ownership in Australia as it gets harder. And another change is seeming to be happening. Well, it's coming on two sides. On the one hand, we're increasing our household size. There's more multi-generation households, and that's happening partly because of affordability issues and partly because of the migrants coming in the way they're used to living. But on the other side, there actually are going to be fewer 1 and 2 bedroom, 1 and 2 person households as well. It's just that we're living longer and more of us are outliving our spouse, our partners. Another change that's going to happen over the next decade is we are going to urbanise more. We're going to have more higher density living. I'm sure you remember the discussions we've had in previous podcasts about how the government's wanting to build 1.2 million new dwellings over the next 5 years, and a lot of them are going to be high-rise or medium density towers. Over the next decade, a couple of other things are going to change. More baby boomers will have retired, but there's also going to be a significant transfer of wealth. That'll commence as the baby boomers start to die out probably in 8 to 10 years' time, and there's a huge wealth transfer. It's been suggested it could be $4, maybe even $6 trillion worth of wealth. Remember, most baby boomers own their homes without a mortgage. I think a big change that's going to happen over the next decade is going to be that many of the jobs we now are familiar with will have disappeared because of AI. But I also believe we're going to be inundated with a whole heap of new technology we haven't even dreamed of yet. I think another factor that's not going to be different, that isn't going to change, is that Australians are going to have to look after their own financial futures. The government is going to find it harder and harder to pay for the pensions and pay for medical care, and that's why we've got superannuation. So that's a great way of looking after your financial future, but it's really, really not enough when many of us are going to live for 30 or 40 years after retirement. So do you have a strategic plan for your investments and your life? I know that you're listening to this podcast because you're interested in getting more financial freedom, more security for yourself. And so that's how we help our clients at Metropole. We're much more than buyer's agents. We help our clients grow into generational wealth safely through strategic property advice. But it all starts by putting a strategic plan together and then helping them implement the plan. Now, over the weekend, I got a couple of emails and one DM from somebody, a direct message from somebody on Instagram wanting to know where to invest and how to invest, and is this property the right one or is this state the right one? And I always say you shouldn't start with the property. The property you eventually buy should be the physical manifestation of a whole lot of decisions you make and make in the right order. And the property is really just the end result, but there's a whole lot of things you've got to do before. But if you go to most buyers agents or property experts, they're going to start with the property because that's what they do. At Metropole, we start with a strategic plan and help you plan to become the person you plan to become. We also know the odds are against you. We know that most property investors never get past their first or second property. We know that about 4% of properties currently on the market are what I'd call investment grade. And we also know that about 50% of those who sell up in the first 5 years, investors just don't get to the next stage. And less than, 92% never get past their first or second property. So how do you beat those terrible odds? You make the right decisions by getting the right advice. Successful property investors understand that getting independent strategic advice is an investment, not a cost. So if you want to outperform the markets this year and moving forward, whether it's buying a home or an investment property, go to metropole.com.au and have a complimentary wealth discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists and explore your options. We've got no properties for sale, and as I said, we're much more than just buyer's agents. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but small enough to care. Go to metropole.com.au.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to explain to you about a chat I had with one of my nephews who suddenly is taking an interest in property and business and success. And he said, what would you have liked to know years ago that would make things different today? Now, that's a great question. And as I discussed things with him, I realized that the topics I was talking about really wasn't as much about property or money as it was about mindset. So these are some of the things I mentioned to him that I wish I had known then. And the first one was to become the pilot of your life, because then everything is going to change. I remember things changed for me when I learned that my thoughts lead to my feelings lead to my actions, and my actions lead to my results. This meant that my inner world, my thoughts and my feelings, controlled my outer world, my actions and my results. The turning point was when I realized that I was responsible for all things, the good and the bad that had happened to me. I then became the pilot of my life and not just a passenger. I also realized that even if it's not true, I know I act differently and my results are better because I believe I'm responsible for everything that happened to me. The second lesson I told Daniel was that when I was young, no one taught me about this thing called the reticular activating system, that part of the brain that only lets you see in your surroundings what you focus on in your thoughts. It pretty much always helps you find what you're looking for. You know that story that if you were going to look for a white Toyota, you were going to buy a new car, all of a sudden on the street you'd see white Toyotas everywhere. It's the reticular activating system that looks for things that you focus on and blocks out other things. It pretty much always helps you find what you're looking for. It's your inbuilt GPS system. And so what I learned, and I would have liked to know it earlier in life, was the importance of setting goals and regularly reviewing them, because it's one way to keep your focus. It keeps you focused on what's important and helps you take actions that are going to move you closer towards where you want to go. The other lesson I told him was that your attitude changes your reality. It's that old glass half full or glass empty story. When things happen in life, things that we don't like, we can either choose to see them as a problem or as a solution waiting to be discovered. Now, to be blunt, it took me quite some time in my life to discover that if you change your attitude, you can actually change your reality. When you have a positive attitude instead of a negative one, you start to see things and viewpoints that were invisible before. At the moment, there's lots of challenges going on in the world, in life, but there always seem to be. But the optimistic people do much, much better in life in general than the pessimists. Another lesson I told him was the importance of giving. You've got to give to receive. As children, we're told that the joy is in giving rather than receiving. But as adults, for many of us, life becomes about what we can get out of somebody or something. However, if you want to increase the value you receive, look, it could be money, love, kindness, opportunities. You've got to increase the value that you give, because over time, what you get is in proportion to what you give out. While it would be nice to get something for nothing, over the years I learned that seldom happens. Another lesson I taught him was to be proactive rather than reactive. There seems to be three types of people out there: those who make things happen, those who watch what happens, and then there's those who sit around and say, hey, what just happened? Be in the first group. Be in that group of people who make things happen, and always be on the lookout for opportunity. Two more lessons I gave him that I'd like to share with you. One is make your time count. How often have you heard people say time flies? Well, indeed it does, so use it wisely. Just as you're careful about how and where you invest your money, you should be careful about how you invest your time. Remember the Pareto principle, that 80-20 rule? It says that 80% of the value we receive comes from 20% of what we do with our time. So what things do you do? What do you spend your time doing that takes a lot of energy, yet delivers few results? Cut those out and use your time wisely. Of course, that also means don't waste your time worrying, because most things you're worrying about are never going to happen. They're just monsters in your mind. If they do happen, they're most likely not going to be as bad as you expected. So now when you're confronted with a challenge, what you should do is put things in perspective. What I ask myself is, what's the worst that could happen? What's the best possible outcome? And what's the most likely thing that's going to happen? This means you shouldn't take things too seriously, because that which seems like a really big problem today, you may not even remember in 5 years' time. So lighten up a little bit. But the other lesson I taught him was mistakes mean growth. Sometimes negative experiences, mistakes and failures can be an even better way of achieving success, because they teach you something that another win, another success probably wouldn't teach you. However, we're so driven with getting things right that we fail to see the value when things go wrong. Instead, we spend our time wishing we'd done it differently, or not doing anything because we're scared of having a mistake. So if things go wrong, learn from your mistakes is what I explained to him. Make it count. Do things differently next time. What I didn't tell him at the time, but I would have liked to, was one thing I'm going to share with you now, and that's don't compare yourself to others. That's one of the things I would have liked to know early too, because when you compare yourself to others, you let the outside world control how you feel about yourself. Clearly, with social media now and seeing everybody's what they eat and what they do and their cars and their lifestyle, it makes some people feel a little bit jealous. Remember, you're seeing people's highlight reels, not all the bits on the cutting room floor. So instead of trying to compare yourself with other people, strive to be the best that you can be, and look at how far you've come, what you've achieved, what you've accomplished. And they're the lessons that I would have liked to know many years ago. And if I've shared them with you and now you're aware of those, maybe it will help you just get that bit of success a little bit sooner. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?